Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 121. Today's guest is William Henry Morris. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. For today's episode, I'm pleased to welcome writer William Henry Morris to the show for a KTCO Book Club conversation. William Henry Morris is a reader, writer, and editor of fiction. His short stories and criticism have been published in Big Echo and elsewhere. William and I have known each other for quite some time, and something we both have an interest in is fiction that blends literary and speculative techniques and tropes. And you couldn't ask for a better fit for that than the book we're discussing today, Sofia Samatar's 2017 story collection, Tender. In addition to Tender, Sofia Samatar is also the author of the World Fantasy Award-winning novel A Stranger in Alondria, and its sequel, The Winged Histories, which was a finalist for the Locus Award. Tender brings together 18 stories originally published between 2012 and 2016, as well as 2 stories new for the collection. These stories show just how broad Samatar's talent is, covering a range of styles and forms and subgenres, from fairy tales and folklore to alternate history to dystopian sci-fi to stories that are almost contemporary realist fiction, and all done at a level of craft that is seldom achieved by writers in any genre. Before William picked this book for our conversation, I had only read a couple of Samatar's stories before, so it was a real treat for me to get to dig into this book with him. A couple of notes before we get started. First, there will be spoilers in this conversation, so if that's something you'd like to avoid, then I'd recommend holding off on listening until after you've read the book. You can order a copy from your local bookstore or library, or there's also a link in the show notes to where you can purchase a DRM-free ebook directly from the publisher, Small Beer Press. Finally, if you've read this collection or any of the specific stories we discuss in our conversation, use the hashtag KTCO Book Club on Twitter to share your thoughts. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with William Henry Morris about Sofia Samatar's book, Tender. I guess the first thing I wanted to say is just that I really appreciated you picking this book. I know that you are a big fan of Sofia Samatar's work. I also am quite a fan of her work. But I'd actually only read 2 of these stories before. I understand that maybe 12 or so were printed elsewhere before being collected, but I'd only read 2 of these stories before, and there's 20 of them in the collection. So it was a real treat for me to get to dive into this collection and see a broader spectrum of what kinds of stuff she writes, which I found really interesting. But where I wanted to start was, what was it about this book that made you want to choose it?
So for me, this was a second read-through. I'd read the collection before. I'd read many of the stories when they were first published in the various science fiction publications and that they came out in. And Sofia Samatar had this great run in the science fiction and fantasy community, where her 2 novels came out, but especially even before the first novel came out, and then between the 2 novels, there were all these stories that were coming out, and every one of them was different and excellent, and at least by me and by many other readers, was just greeted with like this, it's like something has arrived here. Something new is coming into the field. And I just felt like I wanted to revisit that experience and these stories. And especially, to be honest, right now I wanted to feel something, you know?
Yeah.
And I knew that Samatar's stories really do that. Maybe a little bit too much. Sometimes it can be a little, I found myself like only able to read 1 or 2 stories an evening. But I felt like, and especially since you and I share this interest in stories that kind of fall between the literary and the fantastic, that I thought would be both worthwhile for us to have that experience of reading this collection, but also to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, that thing that you said about the stories being so different from each other is something that I found really fascinating about this. So my initial experience with Sofia Samatar's work was through the novels, was through Stranger in Alondria and then The Winged Histories, which are just phenomenal works, I think. And I know you agree. I've seen you talk about that at length before. So I wasn't really sure what to expect initially from a Sofia Samatar short story. The first one that I read was actually the last one that's included in this collection, The Red Thread. And the style of that story is so completely different from the style in the novels that it actually threw me a little bit right at first. I mean, the story itself is an excellent story, and it's one that I really, really enjoy, and I was so happy to get to read it again as part of this book. But it just was not at all what I was expecting based on the novels. It was your first experience with her through her short stories?
I don't remember which of her short stories I read before I read A Stranger in the Alondria. I think a couple of them. I mean, on The Red Thread specifically, that's my favorite story. That's the story that ends the anthology, or the collection. I think there's a reason for that. The style is, yes, different from the fantasy that she writes. And we can get into this maybe a little bit more, but actually rereading the collection, I found, even though the stories are different in perhaps genre or maybe even style, I found a lot more things that ran across the stories than when I had just read it just to read it. But to get back to that difference in style, I think it's clear both through these stories and through the novels that Sofia Samatar is very good at reading other texts and responding to them.
Yes.
At reading discourses in the field and responding to what is happening in that particular discourse at that particular time.
I mean, obviously, I don't know, obvious, but I think people who are familiar with the novels, I mean, those novels are very much about intertextuality and the effect of literature in the world, what the written word can do versus the spoken word. It's really, in many ways, the central driving force behind even the plot of those novels is about the written word and how it's used, how it's interpreted. And I very much agree that is something that, I mean, it's obvious when you read those books how much of a reader she is and how much she has thought about not just what's happening in a story, but also, how does this story live in the world? So, I mean, she's a magnificent reader, and that definitely shows up in the novels. And I agree, it runs across so many of these stories, maybe all of them. It was definitely something that I noticed about them. Let's talk a little bit more about that. What was something that that really stood out to you about that aspect of this collection?
I think with the novels, because they're epic fantasy, what Sofia Samatar was doing in those novels was certainly innovative, but it was also within a vein that is somewhat familiar to us, that they're epic fantasy. A really literary, beautiful, haunting kind of epic fantasy. But, she's in conversation with Tolkien, for sure, and other epic fantasy writers. I think what I noticed with the stories in Tender is that intertextuality, metatextuality gets even more innovative. And I would say in many ways even more personal. Because there are texts that she refers to that are clearly come out of her experience, both as someone who is both African and Mennonite, right? Her mother, I think, grew up in Canada as a Mennonite, and her father was from Africa. But also, I think there's clearly texts that she encountered in graduate school or throughout her higher education experience that she is reacting to and riffing off of and interrogating. And the interesting thing is in the stories, it's all different kinds of texts.
There's this way in which she is, as you say, riffing off of and sort of communicating with different texts, different kinds of texts, whether that might be fairy tales, like traditional European fairy tales, or traditional African or Arabian myths and legends, which I guess maybe is stretching the definition of text in some cases, because these may not be necessarily stories that were written down, but maybe passed down orally, which I think is also something that's sort of addressed in the text of some of these stories in a really interesting way.
Yes. She
also is riffing on academic styles of writing, whether that might be something that you would do in graduate school or something that you do in high school, like the Walk Dog story. It has that style. You know, what's interesting, you mentioned the novels being in conversation with Tolkien, and obviously, I mean, I think that epic fantasy can't help but be in conversation with Tolkien. But what stood out to me, both in the novels, but actually even more in the stories, especially some of the stories, was actually more of a connection to or echoes of Borges.
Well, I think so, yes. And I don't know, you know, whether it's Borges in particular or any of the other writers that deal with that sort of more metatextual approach to fiction. What was interesting to me reading these stories is that everything bleeds into each other. And what I mean by that is that one of the weaknesses or things that a lot of the inheritors of Borges and Kafka don't do is be specific in the detail of their stories. They get way too abstract. And then something that happens with literary science fiction and fantasy as that has become a little bit more popular over the past decade is that writers will use metaphor, and they'll use metaphor as a way to create their fictional worlds, their speculative worlds, but they'll be a little vague about it. They'll be a little precious or too hung up on it. And then another strain of literature that we see, right, is the confessional literature that has become much more popular over the past 10 years with somebody like Nalsgaard, or however you say his name. And Sofia Samatar in these stories does all three at the same time. So that one of the things I notice with rereading the stories is that their premises or the worlds that they build, whether they be science fiction or fantasy or somewhere in between, have a coherence to them. As difficult as these stories can be, if you really read through the details of the story, there is a specific world and narrative with bounds. At the same time, there's this metatextual world or intertextual world going on. And at the same time, there's this autobiographical detail, even if it's not exactly Sofia Samatar, the person, that gets woven into the stories as well. And sometimes that's all as one coherent story. And sometimes it kind of falls apart, or like a river, it changes course. I'm thinking of Meet Me in Aram, which, or An Account of the Land of Witches, where we start out with something that seems very fairy tale-like or mythic and ends up being like, oh my goodness, this is about a person living in our reality.
Especially with those stories in particular, you know, I think so much of speculative fiction it is sort of like the cliche thing that people talk about with especially science fiction as being prescient or in some way, right? That writers are predicting the future. When you talk to the writers of these supposedly prescient stories, they will say, no, I was actually just talking about the time that I live in now. And I feel like the way that speculative fiction kind of always or so often is commenting on the now and the real world by, you know, sort of, often it can be sort of allegorical, the way the stories are done. But I feel like what Samatar is doing in stories like that, really in all of these stories, it's not as neat as allegory. And especially in the way that she's blending these sort of fantastic elements with more realist elements is something that, I mean, I've seen other people do before. I don't know if I've seen anyone else do it quite so skillfully. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. In some ways, almost all these stories feel like they could be reporting.
And that's really foregrounded in some of them, right?
Yes.
Like
yes, but even ones where it's not foregrounded.
Yeah. It's a really interesting effect. It is really an interesting effect. So I want to you had mentioned that you had a top 5 stories when we went in the pre-show. And I want to get to that, but I want to just sort of start with the first story, since this is what opens the collection. One of the things I always find really interesting about story collections or poetry collections is how they are sequenced and how they are sort of grouped. Like in this story collection, we have 20 stories, but they're grouped into 2 sections. The first one's called Tender Bodies. The second one is called Tender Landscapes. And the first story, which I think I would love to talk about your impressions of those groupings. But just to start us off, the first thing that opens us up is the story that's called Selkie Stories Are for Losers. So this is a story that's metatextual in the way that it's talking about Selkie stories, but it also is a Selkie story. And Selkies, of course, are the sort of Gaelic were-seal myth and legend. That the stories, and this is sort of talked about in the story itself by the narrator, about how the stories always kind of had the same shape. They're kind of always about the same thing. The story itself is an example of the kind of thing that she's critiquing. I'm not sure that's the right word. And so I feel like this story kind of, because of the way that it's structured to be the thing that it's referencing and to sort of be interrogating while participating in this sort of literary, if you want to call it that, or mythical, legendary tradition, is really sets the stage very nicely for the rest of the collection. But I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that.
So I believe a couple of Sofia Samatar's short stories had already been published in the field before this came out. But this was, as I recall, this was a story that really put her on the radar. This was a story that got passed around Twitter for 6 months, and referenced all the time. And to me, what's interesting about it is that it does set the pattern in the sense that this is really a literary fiction story or a contemporary realism story about two young women who have moms that are difficult, that are troubled, and them wanting to not be their moms. But then, of course, what happens is Sofia Samatar layers on this whole notion of the Selkie story. And the Selkie story, it's almost always the woman who is the Selkie, who is captured by the man and brought into this domestic sphere and keeps trying or hoping to escape by getting possession of her silk skin again, so that she can go back to the ocean. She can go back to where she belongs. And the problem for the narrator is that if your mom is a Selkie, that means they're going to leave you, right? Once they get the thing back that makes them fully themselves, they're no longer fit for the domestic sphere to be your mom, and no longer part of a romantic relationship. And so we have the narrator who is in love with Mona. Do we know what nationality Mona is? Is she Italian or Greek?
I'm not really sure.
Anyway, but they both work at a restaurant that belongs to Mona's family. And the narrator falls in love with Mona and wants a relationship with her, but wants one that is going to be different from what her parents and Mona's parents have, right? There can't be a Selkie in their relationship. She just wants she and Mona to be in love and to be together. As she says, at one point, we've got to be tougher than our moms. And so the plan is to move to Colorado because it's not near an ocean. But of course, can't really do that because they still have their moms. Or at least Mona still has her mom.
I think, one of the things that I found really interesting about this story is, as you mentioned, in the traditional Selkie story, it's very much often about the Selkie figure is almost always a woman. And there's an element to that is very reflective of the sort of patriarchal context in which these stories come from. And I feel like there is a way that what Sofia Samatar is doing in this story, and also since this story, or, one thing that this story is doing that I've seen a lot more often, more recently, is like there is sort of a trend, I feel like, in contemporary, especially fantasy, either interrogating or reiterating or doing things with fairy tales. That seems to be very popular right now. And many of my favorite speculative fiction short story writers are ones that I associate with that sort of trend, like people like Kat Howard does that a lot, or Amal El-Mokhtar does that sometimes. I'm not sure if all of their stories came after Sofia Samatar was, initial rise, but I do feel like maybe those stories are at least in conversation with each other, if not necessarily perhaps indebted to one another. But this way that the more contemporary stories are sort of dealing with or commenting on the ways that the traditional fairy tales are not necessarily very affirming of or even concerned with the way that women appear in them, is something that is very, intentionally undermined by the way that the newer stories are engaging with the same constructs. And I feel like this story is one that sort of does that but it does it in a way that, like, it doesn't feel polemic. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So there is a long tradition of feminist retellings of fairy tales. But I agree that it's gotten kind of more prolific or more intense in the past decade or so. And I would also mention Theodore Goss. Some of her work is really awesome for that kind of thing. But here's to me what the genius of the story is. It's not about the Selkie or the man who captured the Selkie. It's about the kid who realizes that her mom is a Selkie. And I don't want to minimize the standard feminist kind of turning things around where you tell the story from the perspective of the Selkie. That's an awesome approach. But what Sofia Samatar is doing is interrogating something a little bit different, I think, and which makes it more about relationships, and especially real-world relationships. No, that's not the right way to say it.
They're relationships that feel authentic, for sure.
Yes. So what is the narrator's fear about kissing Mona, right? Because she has this moment in the story where she wants to kiss Mona, but she doesn't. And the fear is not that Mona won't kiss her back, but that she will, but she won't mean it. And the Selkie never means it. Right? The Selkie is always waiting to get their skin back. So anything the Selkie does in the story to make their partner happy, and especially to make it seem like there's a romantic relationship happening, is to lure that partner, their captor, into a false sense of security so that they have a chance of getting their skin back. And the moment they do, they're out of there.
I think there's a thing of, what you were just saying about the way that this story takes a different angle on this is something that recurs again and again throughout this collection. And, one of the things you had mentioned, for example, is how the world building, the sort of world building, obviously something that speculative readers tend to pay a lot of attention to, right? And I mean, this is the sort of cliche, at least, right? That literary readers are not as concerned with world building because the world building isn't sort of integral to the construction of the story. It's sort of taken as read already. And I agree that her worlds that she's building here are done with a thoroughness that is more than enough to satisfy any speculative reader. But I find that a lot of what she's doing throughout the collection is like the world may be fully realized somewhere off the page, but it's not like explained, right? It's not like explained more than is relevant to what's happening in this character's immediate life. Some things are left not ambiguous, but just they are referenced in a way that it sort of assumes that the reader, especially because so many of these stories are told in the first person, it's sort of done as though the reader is expected to already be familiar with aspects of this world that would be familiar to someone that lives in that world. And that does a really interesting thing because on the one hand, it gives a sense of authenticity that gives the action of the story more impact, I think. But also, I think it sort of enables Samatar to do sort of exactly the thing that you are talking about right here, where the story can be about something other than just that sort of speculation about what would the world look like in this sort of a case. You know what I mean? Like here, what you're talking about with the narrator and the two young women in the first story, how the speculative element here is, okay, werseals exist and they are like they are in these common fairy tales. What would that look like? But it's not really about that. It's about a different angle on the same thing. And I feel like that happens again and again throughout the collection,
Yes. Let's talk about Honey Bear, because I think this is going to reinforce what you just said, which I completely agree with. In Selkie stories for losers, you could perhaps read that there is no Selkie, that the narrator's mom isn't a Selkie. But in Honey Bear, it's clearly a science fiction story. And to me, it really captures her approach because we have this science fiction world, and our understanding of it unfolds very slowly because, as you noted, she operates in a literary where we only receive the details that we need to know for each part of the story. But we have this science fiction world where clearly there's been an alien invasion, even though these aliens are called fairies.
Mm-hmm.
And these aliens are very alien. They have wings. They excrete toxic substances that kill life. the slicks is what they're called, right?
Mm-hmm.
And humans are still existing in this world, but they have to exist in the spaces that are allowed them by the aliens. And so you've got this huge concept that's very familiar to readers of science fiction. What happens to the humans when there's this alien invasion? And yet, the story itself is a thoroughly domestic situation. Familiar to any parent. What happens when you're out on the road, you're going on a trip, and your child has a bathroom accident, right? That's what the story is essentially is. That's the action of the story. And yet it's about way more than that. And it ends up being definitely science fiction, definitely kind of domestic literary, potentially fantasy if you're reading the aliens is more fantastic. And it's also a horror story.
That was one of the stories that I really responded very strongly to for sort of multiple reasons, because, just on, like, as you're saying, the main action of the story is very domestic. And so, having kids of my own that, to deal with bathroom accidents on road trips.
Right.
It was obviously very familiar to me. And that story being told in the first person makes sort of the emotion of it so immediate. And it's handled in this way that, again, the authenticity of emotion is just stunning. But then also the story is also very apocalyptic, right? Mm-hmm. And that is also something that feels unfortunately exceptionally relevant right now. But apocalyptic fiction has had its relevance for quite some time. I mean, I think you and I are around the same age. I had to read Alas, Babylon when I was in like middle school or high school, or on the beach, having these sort of tragic apocalyptic stories or heroic apocalyptic stories. There's a present relevance, but likely there's going to be a continuing relevance. This does seem to be a thing that we're always interested in. But then additionally, and this was an aspect that, again, I don't know if it's actually subtle or if it's not subtle and I'm just taking it to be subtle. I don't even know if this would have occurred to me, this reading of this story, if I had encountered it on its own instead of as part of this particular collection. But there's a way in which, because these, the narrator and her husband are presented as, they come across as very American. I'm not sure if it's specified exactly that they are American, but they come across as American at least. And yet they are put in this place where their space, their land is being colonized. And there are a lot of stories in here that address this aspect of colonialism, and some of them seem very directly related to, the history of European colonization of Africa. But then there are stories like this one that seem to take sort of an angle on it, where now we're putting the people who are traditionally the colonizers and putting them in the role of the colonized. And I thought that was really smart.
Mm-hmm. No, that is definitely a persistent theme in the collection.
Yeah.
But it's also, so there's that. But then there's also this layer of being parents in a nation that maybe isn't, as much as we pay verbal homage to the whole idea of the nuclear family and the importance of parents and parenting, of where there's this shame or potential shame in being a parent in public that I think is another strand that gets pulled through. And especially the experience of being a woman, of having a female body and having children, and the risk and the trade-offs and the sacrifices that takes, and how you have a spouse who understands but also doesn't.
Right.
And so it's again this domestic situation where it's not just the accidents, it's then also this vampire alien fairy child needs to be fed. And in order to do this, in fact, the whole decision that the narrator makes to do this requires her to literally change and sacrifice her body in a way that's even more extreme than the normal process of having a child.
Yeah, I couldn't help thinking about all of the ways that, I mean, you and I are both parents, but neither of us are mothers. And
right.
So, there's going to be an aspect of this that isn't accessible through direct experience to us. But I think that I was thinking about how I mean, the scenes here where, it's revealed how the narrator is feeding Honey Bear.
Mm-hmm.
There's a grotesqueness to it and
Yes.
a sort of body horror kind of aspect to it. But also, like, it definitely does feel like, I mean, I was just reminded of the ways that my wife, when she was breastfeeding, would talk about how she felt like, her body wasn't her own anymore. I would have to imagine that this is sort of like part of the intended reading here, right?
Oh, for sure. And, and if you're a parent who, let's say you're the father or you're the parent who isn't feeding the child or isn't the primary take of the child, if you don't cringe about the father in this story who wants everything to be done precisely and on schedule, and this is how we do it, and he's right, they have to do it because otherwise this accident could happen that could have a huge impact on the world and could get them in trouble. And yet really it's not about the guy.
Right.
It's about the relationship between the child and the primary caretaker, and especially the person who's actually actively feeding the child with their own body. And so in some sense, this is also like a situation comedy. I mean, it's amusing in that it takes a situation that parents know very well and raises the stakes to like the nth degree, but it's also horrifying and morbidly amusing, not just haha funny.
I feel like there is a lot here in this story. And then again, like I keep using this phrase throughout the collection, but the interaction between the dad and the mom in this story feels very authentic, and it feels like very much like on the one hand, a comment on sort of the interaction between men and women. But again, it doesn't feel polemic, right? And I feel like there are a lot of examples in this collection where, because are all of the stories told from a woman's point of view? I can't think now, but certainly most of them are. I think all of them are.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Okay. Some of them more than others are very directly commenting on, I'm not really sure what the right phrasing is to use, but like the stories feel very deeply feminist to me. Yeah.
Oh yeah. There are, numerous stories that are particular rebukes, I would say even, or interrogations of the patriarchy, not just the specific patriarchal figure in the story, but also the writers of some of the stories that she's riffing on. So she takes on, so a girl who comes out of chamber at regular intervals, that takes on A.T.A. Hoffman, I'm pretty sure. There's one that takes on Freud.
Right, that's the Olympia's Ghost.
Olympia's Ghost.
Yeah.
And then actually Meet Me in Aram, which gets even more complicated and interesting in relation to patriarchy. But I didn't know this, and I had to look this one up. But apparently Iram or Iram, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, is specifically referenced not only in the Quran, which appears in the story, but Lovecraft uses that in his Cthulhu stories. And in fact, in the Call of Cthulhu, that the city Aram is the center for the Cthulhu cult. So over and over again, Samatar is taking a very precise look at the patriarchy, not only within the context of the story, but also metatextually.
So you had, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, you had sort of assembled a top 5, your favorite stories in this collection. So
yeah,
that seems like I don't think we have time to discuss every single story in the collection in just one conversation, but that might be a good way to sort of give a little bit of an overview. So how would you like to approach this? Start from number 1 and work our way down, or the other way?
Let's do that, because I have 4 stories tied for my 5th place.
Okay. All right. So what's your number 1?
My number 1 story is The Red Thread.
The Red Thread. Okay.
Yeah, this is a story that really made me fall in love with Sofia Samatar as a short story writer.
Yeah. So here again, we have a very apocalyptic story. It is a story that's set after a huge societal collapse that, involved a lot of upheaval. And there's a lot of stuff referenced that is not exactly fully explained, but, we have these sort of nomadic people moving from community to community. And the story is told in an epistolary form, as the narrator is the daughter of a former activist, and they're going from place to place and leaving sort of emails for this other young man who used to travel with them. And this was, as I think I said this already, that one of the only stories from this collection that I had read before.
Mm-hmm.
And it is one that I also immediately loved when I read it for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think I am sort of a sucker for an epistolary story, especially when done well, as this one is. And Samatar, I think we can rightly call her a master of the epistolary form. Many of her stories are done in this form or in an adjacent form, we might say. But so this story is at the same time a very, in some ways, kind of conventional post-apocalyptic story, but then at the same time feels completely fresh as well. And I wanted to sort of get your sense of what it is that this story is doing that makes it feel that way.
Yeah, that's really the point of this story, right? Mm. Is that it's using a post-apocalyptic American landscape. Sarah, the letter writer. It's an epistolary story, but the messages pretty much only go in one way. Mm-hmm. But she specifically references that they're traveling through the Dakotas. And to me, what I like so much about it, and I think what it's doing that's a little bit different, is that there is just a little bit of hope in this story. That there's a world that exists in this story that isn't just like one location, like what you'd find in Station 11, right? Mm-hmm. There's this network of centers. These centers also have numbers, right? So they've been cataloged in some way. And these centers provide refuge for people who are willing to not be violent and not steal from each other, right? That's the whole thing that happens in this post-apocalyptic world is, and why Sarah's mother keeps moving and they keep traveling is that the whole idea is that if somebody is being violent, that you just leave. And that zone where they exist becomes a zone that you don't go to. And instead, you find your way to the next center, the next place that is peaceful and is where people are providing mutual aid to each other. And so for all of this bleak post-apocalyptic world, there's this actual network of people and then literally this mesh network of messages. This is how Sarah is able to send messages to Fox, is that there are these separate internet networks that can connect to each other. It's taking an idea that exists here in the real world and actually thinking about how that might work if the big telecoms all go down. Mm-hmm. And so it ends up being surprisingly hopeful. And you see in the story a sense of community and a willingness for people to help each other out that we don't necessarily feel all the time in the world that we're currently living in, right? That this existence of late capitalism, this existence of precarity. There's precarity in this post-apocalyptic world, but there's also community.
What this story is doing, like with this sense of community, like there are ways that it almost feels like, I mean, there are aspects of it that are almost utopic, you know, like because so much of this, and this is something that the mother character even gets into arguments with people about, you know, what the way is supposed to be, that people are supposed to be being if they're following this ideology, right, is sort of a utopic ideology, right? Of being completely peaceful, of being completely free to move. I feel like there is this almost inversion of a utopia story here happening, which I guess, again, is not completely new idea in sort of apocalyptic fiction, but I can't think of another story that does it quite like this. I mean, apocalyptic fiction is always very driven by danger, and that appears here as well. And there is, in some way, a sense, too, because of the fact that Sarah and her mother are constantly moving, there is this sort of sense of a looming threat that these, I think she calls them exclusion zones, where the violent people are maybe getting bigger.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is a lot of real decency being shown between the characters that do live in these centers, although there's also sort of some amount of conflict about what exactly it means to live in one of these communities and what they are and are not willing to tolerate. But, you know, here again, also, although the plot of the story is very driven by this apocalypse, and very driven by this looming menace of impending danger. And there is, of course, personal tragedy in it as well. Sarah's mom dies, maybe 2/3 of the way through the story, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
But also, sort of to what you were saying about some of the other stories, what really attracts me to this story is how personal it is. Because even though you only get one side of this conversation, Fox doesn't really write back. And in the one case where he does appear to write back, we don't get his response. We just get Sarah's response to his response, which I thought was just a beautiful and really wonderful and uplifting way to end the story. But you still very much get a sense of Fox as a character through the things that she says to him. And this relationship between the two of them feels very, I don't know. I mean, it is, of course, central because of the fact that, how the story is structured. But to me, this, I think, relationship between those two characters, as well as the relationship of Sarah and her mother, I think that's what really ends up sticking with me,
Yeah. So two things that kind of related to the personal and the political, right? So the whole concept of the movement, and at one point, Sarah explains that the movement originally was called something else. It was called greening. So this is not only a post-apocalyptic story, this is a climate change story. That clearly, well, maybe not clearly, but based on my reading, that the reason that things have kind of fallen apart is that there are fewer resources, and that the isolationists or the people that they stay away from are trying to gather up as many resources as they can. And the movement, all the people who are always moving are trying to build the movement, build the network, but also carefully pull out whatever resources they can to keep themselves alive. And it's not like they're living well.
Yeah.
I mean, at one point, one of the highlights is they're in a center, and one of the people in the center opens a can of something sweet, some sort of preserved, I forget what it is, and passes it around. They each get like a spoonful. But I want to read just a quick passage. Sarah is writing to Fox, and she's remembering the way that Fox and her mother were talking at one point. We should also mention that Sarah's mom, while she was alive, had to use a wheelchair. She says, "You kneel in the dirt by her chair and rest your slate on the arm. Leaning together, you talk about how to make the movement last, how to keep the mesh nets running, how to draw power tenderly from the world. And later, you told me that you and I were perfect for each other because we both wanted to draw lines over the land, mine visible, yours in code. But the truth is, you were perfect for Mom." And so the his in code has to do with, I think we're given to understand that Fox is trying to figure out how to keep the mesh nets going and maybe even improve them. And with Sarah, it's literally the red thread. It's where she would do these art projects where she would take red plastic and turn it into threads and weave it in various art installation pieces.
It's a story that, like I say, I think I read it the first time a couple of years ago, and it's never really left me. And I think the thing that ends up sticking with me the most is just the last line. I mean, it's not an uplifting story, right? I mean, it is a story of things have already crashed, and in many ways things seem like they may be getting worse. But there is just such a tenderness in the last line, which is, I mean, it's just her acknowledging that he finally wrote her back. And I think to me that is something, I've said this to other people a number of times, but so much in the world feels so challenging and scary right now. As indeed I'm sure it has felt at many other times in the past. But it is those moments of connection, and often for me that comes about through doing this show.
Yeah.
It is those moments of connection that feel like what sustains me, at least. And I think it is ultimately what sustains all of us, and having the story end on that felt, I can't quite think of the right adjective, but it was meaningful.
Yeah, previous to that, one of the messages that she sends before Fox writes back, it says, "Dear Fox, hey, it's Sarah. Sometimes I just feel like leaving one word, even if it's just my name, a single thread."
Yeah. Oh boy. Okay, so what was your number 2?
Number 2 is Tender.
Tender. Okay. Yeah.
This story just blows my mind. I don't even know quite how to approach it.
So interestingly, this story There's at least 2 stories in this collection. This one and Request for an Extension on the Clarity that involve a narrator who is isolated by choice in a sort of technological milieu. This story, so it's the title story of the collection. And the word tender takes on a couple of different meanings here. Literally, this person who is isolated by choice in some kind of a radioactive waste facility or something like that is tending to the facility. So she is a tender.
Right.
But there's obviously a lot more going on than just that interpretation of the word. And I think there is also a way in which both this narrator and the narrator of that other story that I mentioned, there's a lot referenced about that person's past, about her connections to people outside of this bubble that she lives in. And the question that seems to sort of animate the story, at least in my reading, is why would a person choose to isolate themselves in this way so totally?
Right.
And it is sort of a haunting story. So what is it that strikes you most about this story?
It's the way that the historical references, the radioactive imagery, the parallelisms, the dual or triple or more meanings, and even puns just spiral until it's almost too much. So it starts out like what you might expect from a really good literary science fiction story, where she describes the fact that, yes, that she's in this glass enclosure that apparently is above or near, I think above this containment center, and sort of describes what that's like and starts to talk about a friend of hers. And you're going, okay, this is interesting. And then all of a sudden Samatar starts going into the history of various things. And it all just starts to pile up. And all of a sudden it's a story, it's about radioactivity, right? About sensitivity to the environment. And I think really what broke me is when we get to a line at some point where she says, because glass is a true thread. It says, the cheap green glass of the 30s, I recall, is known as depression glass. It's also a story about depression.
One of the things that she does, so in this story, she does this thing, and I think this is sort of, again, speaking to this idea of coming at things at an angle that I had sort of mentioned a bit before, because this is not the only story where she does this, but here she starts talking about the history of things. So throughout this story, there are things that she's sort of talking about her own history, but mostly she's doing this in the third person as though she's telling somebody else's story, which I think was a really interesting sort of distancing sort of technique, right? And I don't mean technique as Samatar distancing, but rather the fact that Samatar is writing a character who herself is choosing to distance herself from her own story. I think this is one of the things that she does so well in these stories, is that the characters who are narrating these stories feel very alive in this way that, I mean, I don't know how you are, and I guess I can't speak to how anybody else is, but for me, a lot of times the thing that I want to talk about, or the thing that I think I'm thinking about, isn't really the thing that I'm thinking about. So it'll maybe be that I'm thinking about some historical thing because I'm trying to distract myself from what I really need to be thinking about that's going on in my life, or something like that. And here in this story, sort of sprinkled throughout, sometimes it's just a 1-sentence paragraph that will be about some real historical thing, like the Radium Girls.
Right.
Or, some sort of esoteric fact about plutonium, that you can definitely see how all of these things are a metaphor for the things that the narrator is thinking and feeling and sort of haunted by, but they don't feel like a metaphor. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but they are metaphors, but they don't feel like metaphors because they're relevant to the thing that she's thinking and feeling. But I think this is actually how people really are, right? Like that instead of thinking about the real thing, they'll be thinking about this other thing that only sort of tangentially touches on what's actually happening for them. And so often in this collection, Samatar is sort of asking us to make these connections as the reader. And I think that really deepens the experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This is why we write and read speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is taking metaphor and making it real, teasing it out, saying, okay, let's take this concept, this novum, this metaphor, and see what would happen if we treated it as if it were real, as if it could actually happen. And so this is a story about a woman who comes to view herself as, quote, toxic, and so chooses to sequester herself from the rest of the world. And so, okay, in the stereotypical version of that story, this is a tragic story about a woman who just can't deal with the world. And maybe some of the fault is hers, and maybe some of the fault is society's, and, okay, yeah, that's a fairly obvious narrative. But by bringing in the history, and by bringing in kind of the science fictional elements, and by bringing in the extra layers of metaphor, and then having the narrator think about herself in relation to all of those elements, all of a sudden we get a much richer portrait of who she is and why she made the decision, but also how the world, and especially the kind of the forces that we unleash in modernism in the 20th century, have had an impact on both the earth itself and individuals, especially women.
I also very much loved this story, and I think it's interesting. So far, it seems like we've mostly been responding to similar stories. I said in the pre-show I didn't put together a top 5 for myself, and I will say not every single story in this collection struck me as deeply or resonated as deeply as the rest of them, but this definitely was one that did.
Yeah, this is virtuosic territory here.
Yeah. Okay, so where are we going next? Your number 3.
So my number 3 is a story that's unique to the collection. It's the longest story in the collection. It's called Fallow.
I was hoping you would mention this one.
Okay, good. So this is Mennonites in space,
right,
basically. But of course, it's very different from other space colonization stories.
I mean, just to begin with, one typically
start.
Doesn't think of Mennonites and space together.
Right. All right, so this was probably where I should get into a little of my own autobiography. So in addition to being someone who writes and reads and sometimes writes about science fiction and fantasy, I also have this minor career. Well, career is not the right word. I am a figure in the very small world of independent Mormon literature, especially weird Mormon literature.
Mm-hmm.
And so Mormons in space is a thing.
Yes.
It's in the expanse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've written my own stories, including one that was published on Big Echo about Mormons in space. And so I am quite familiar with how the field, both Mormon writers and also not Mormon writers, have tended to deal with this whole notion of Mormons and either post-apocalyptic fiction or more often space opera.
Mm-hmm.
And the connection is made is very tempting, right? Because Mormons, pioneers, generation ships, pioneering, settling, that kind of whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a field that I'm very familiar with. And what blew me away about Fallow is that if you really read through the story, it's science fiction. It's as good, I guess you could even call it hard science fiction, as any story of that type. But that's not really what it's about. What
right.
she does is she starts with this idea of this group of Mennonites who have been on a generation ship, and they finally find a planet that is not really hospitable, but they can make it work as a place to settle because it has a similar gravity to that of Earth, has some resources, and so that's what they do. And she also packs all the core arguments and tensions that come along with being a minority religious group into it and makes it kind of, to me, harder science fiction than most hard science fiction because she's dealing not only with the restraints of physics and the hardships and difficulties of colonizing this alien world, but also how those conditions then specifically impact the culture and specifically impact a culture that was a minority culture and a very unique culture on Earth.
Right. So, knowing your deep knowledge and experience with Mormon science fiction was really the reason why I was so interested to get your take on this story. What strikes me, so this, as you say, it is in many ways like a hard science fiction story about space colonization. And in that respect, it shares elements with stories that we have seen before. But I have never read anything like this.
Yeah.
It is a story about community, obviously. And it is a story about religion, obviously. And it is a story about patriarchy. It is a story about human endeavor, and it's a political story.
It's a coming of age story.
It is a coming of age story. And the sort of relationship between science fiction and religion is one that is sort of, I think, necessarily fraught. And most commonly in the sort of history of science fiction, we find writers who are sort of atheist or agnostic, or at least generally secular, critiquing the sort of impacts or structures or epistemologies of religious philosophies, I guess, or religious cultures. And there is an aspect of that here that is, I think, in many ways front and center in the action of the story. However, what really struck me about this story is that there is no way that anyone could write a story like this without being deeply, deeply familiar with the culture that they're talking about. I think I already did know this, but I went and looked it up to confirm again. You know, Sofia Samatar has experience with and family members that grew up Mennonite, right?
Right.
So what she's presenting in here is going to be very much driven by and probably in reference to things that she knows from her own life. And I think that there is a way, there's this sort of, again, I've used this word already, haunted or haunting kind of quality to it, where it's not just a critique, right? It's not, I mean, it very much is a critique of certain elements of this society, but it is also a critique that is, when I'm not religious, so I don't have this exact experience, but I think there's a parallel where your family, say, like, right, my family, there are things about my family that I can and do critique and criticize, sometimes publicly, and yet they are still my family. And it hurts me. Like it is like a source of pain in my life that my family is this way because I love them. And there's a tension between, I want you not to be this way anymore because I don't agree with it. But also there's a part of me that maybe wants me to be the one to change. Like, what if I could just fit into that kind of thing that feels so present, like vibrating throughout this story, that really just knocked me out. And so now I've talked a whole bunch. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All of that. But also even just, I think that part of what this shows is the strength of, and this is a strength that Samatar has across her work, of using particular detail and bringing that into the story so that, and again, I don't know the Mennonite tradition super well, but some of the language that is used, some of the things that they wear, the rituals, the way that they talk to each other, all of that comes into the story. And so you end up with a story to me that is full of rich characters because it's drawing on a particular tradition and a particular way of living and a particular set of beliefs. You know, it's not just about this colony world either. It's about what they believe about Earth and the eventual destiny of Earth, which is a very interesting question for writing science fiction about people who are religious. Because every tradition has some sort of belief about the eventual fate of the world, or the fate of the souls that are a part of this world, or whatever end state or next state you want to talk about related to that tradition. And that belief is really central to the core traumatic events and tensions that lead to all the narrative that happens in this story. And there's this line, so basically the colony is, their generation ship has landed on this planet. It's not hospitable for human life in terms of the air.
Right, they have to live underground.
Right, so the community lives underground, and then some of the people in the community live or at least work inside the generation ship.
Which they call the castle.
The castle, exactly. And they have some sort of communication device that is able to pick up information that is being relayed from Earth to the planet. And it says, so there's this line here where it says, it is estimated that we returned to Earth 500 years after Gabriel. This is what they've named their device. Gabriel is an angel in the Abrahamic tradition. After Gabriel reports a total absence of human life. And what that says about what this community believes about Earth and the people that are left on Earth is pretty horrifying.
Yeah.
And if that's what's driving, if that's what's central to how you're approaching the whole endeavor that you've set out for yourself, that's going to mess things up a bit, I think.
Yeah.
And yet, there are reasons to believe that that's kind of what they needed to do, because Earth was getting so bad that it was no longer hospitable for them and their way of life.
This is something that really is sort of, I mean, it is sort of what I was talking about here, right? Is that it would be so easy for a story like this to just cast the sort of religious leaders here and the religion itself as purely villainous. But it really doesn't do that, right? Like the reason why, I mean, so if anybody knows anything about Mennonites, the general lay public knows anything about Mennonites, it's that they're not into technology, right?
Right.
And, you know, they are associated with living a more traditional agrarian lifestyle. And so what's addressed in this is that this sort of sect of Mennonites came to believe that the world was headed towards some kind of an apocalypse due to wars or climate change or both. And so they decided that it would be okay for them to start depending on technology as a way of so that they could continue to exist. And the thing that's presented here, and of course there is a level of filtering here because this is sort of the received teachings that the narrator gets about their past. Mm-hmm. But it's never really presented as they were completely wrong about that, right? Like there were wars and there were bad things happening. And those critiques really do apply in many ways to the sort of technological culture that our planet now, you know, is dominated by, right? I mean, it's not just like Mennonites who are looking at the world that we live in now and saying we're headed for a catastrophe. And I think that way of, you know, there is a reasonable way that you could arrive at this conclusion is sort of energizing the tension in this story, which is very much about like sort of the main character, the narrator, and many of the people that she is talking about and trying to relate their stories are, what are we like? Is there room for in our society for new kinds of knowledge and knowings? Is there room for there to be change? Is there room for us to question things? And the ways in which the answer to those questions is presented as no, there's a brutality to it as presented in this story. But it's also, you're not unable to see the reasons why the answer is no, right? And it makes the story so much more complex and interesting and rich. You know, it's not like it's not ambivalent in its morality. I don't think that it is that. I don't think it's taking a both sides kind of argument here, but it is presenting, to the extent that the story can be said to be making an argument at all, which I don't think good fiction isn't necessarily trying to make an argument. And I don't know that Samatar is trying to make an argument here, but to the extent that we can say the story is making an argument, it is a complex and nuanced one.
I think this is also where the hard science fiction comes in, because throughout the hard SF stories, especially when you're talking about a colony on an alien planet or a space station, it's by nature a confined space and a fragile space. And because of that, there have to be certain rules, certain places you can go and you can't go, certain codes of conduct, a certain way that you have to deal with the rest of the community so that everybody stays sane and, you know, none of the systems fall apart, basically so that you avoid extinction. And so to that extent, yes, you can kind of understand why the church leadership have this tight grip that they have. But then could you have that kind of, could there be room for a little bit more innovation and a little bit more diversity and that sort of thing? And this is one of the core tensions here. And so what lies at the heart of the story is there's this mystery that I think her name's Agar, the narrator is slowly uncovers, which is that a while back there's this attempted schism. If you know anything about minority religions, schisms are just part of, well, actually any religion, but especially a minority religions, where someone has a different idea. And so at one point, the narrator is talking with her sister, who has she's much more dissatisfied with the status quo. And so they're talking about the schism that happened. And the narrator says, you know, there's only one church. And her sister Tamara says, well, but, you know, why couldn't they have their own little church like we used to have on Earth, and all the debates they had, and they had schisms? And the narrator says, but isn't a schism terrible? And Tamar says, and now I'm going to go directly text, she says, I know it's bad, but at least the Earthmen had space. If people didn't like the way other people were doing things, they could leave. They could go off over the next hill and build their own church, brew coffee on Sunday to their heart's content, wear bonnets with strings or without as they liked. It was a bigger world. More extreme, though, I countered. Oh, extreme. I could hear her smirking in the dark. Brother Pike's favorite word. I retreated into silence as usual. I couldn't bear fighting with her. And as usual, she went on arguing alone into the night. She demanded to know what had happened to the lukewarm being spat out of the mouth of God. Had we forgotten about that? Now all we talked about was moderation, the middle path, keeping the balance, biding our time. We think we're preserving the church, she said, but the earthwind wouldn't recognize us. They wouldn't even recognize our coffee. And so this also kind of has echoes back to like the red thread, right? With that idea of, you go where the people that you don't want to be around with aren't. But then also, this is a key tension in religion, right? Mm-hmm. But then also, I think it's a very telling passage for where we're at right now in this country. And this is just one piece of the kind of the thematics that Sofia Samatar weaves into this story. Yeah. It's fantastic.
It is. Yeah. I don't want to rush through this story, but we're already 2:00. So I want to make sure that we can cover at least the rest of what the rest of your list was. So
number 4 is How to Get Back to the Forest.
So, okay, this one is the story that is about sort of an imagined future where everyone in this society is taken from their parents at a young age and raised in a camp where they are sort of trained for what their role in later life is going to be. And it is sort of the narrator relating the story of her experience at camp, and in particular of this one girl who she knew at camp who was a bit of a rebel. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was another one that really struck me particularly. I mean, it starts off with this image of the children being bugged and what that literally means, having a device placed in there somewhere in their esophagus that can monitor and track them. It's such a, like, the way that this is just opens the story with this image is so, really grabbed me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this was another one that, there's a lot going on here.
There is, and it's the details of what's going on that, again, to me, elevates us beyond your standard kind of dystopic, nearish future science fiction story. Mm-hmm. There's also, I don't know, is there a little bit of doubt about whether the bug exists or not?
Maybe. I mean, it seemed I came away with the impression that it was real, but then there's this scene where they're in the bathroom and the friend sort of vomits out her, she forces herself to vomit until it comes out. But I guess there is a little bit of ambiguity about, whether or not she really did see it because it gets flushed away quickly. Yeah.
Right. So we get this vivid description of it, but then the narrator casts a little bit of doubt on the description. And the thing with the bug is that it not only seems to be a monitoring device, but it also seems to emit some chemical cocktail that helps keep them kind of calm and compliant. Right. And so they're placed in these cohorts and they go off to camp and they're trained for whatever their occupation is going to be. And the expectation is that they'll partner up with and also be friends with kind of everybody in their cohort.
Right. Like you were saying, this idea of there being a sort of dystopic near future story, where people are in camps or whatever, or, they're being sort of like a societal brainwashing or any number of different spins on this is not a new idea. I think one of the things that definitely is different about this story is that, when you compare it to something like the Divergent series or
Hunger Games.
That's the one I was thinking. For some reason, the name had jumped out of my head. The story is a story about uncovering some sort of conspiracy and then participating in a usually violent uprising to overthrow this oppressive regime. That is not what's happening here.
No.
That this is the story of a person who didn't, who may have, at least ostensibly been presented with an opportunity to do so and chose not to. And that makes it, I think, a much more interesting story. I mean, not to take anything away from the sort of YA dystopic fiction that's very popular right now. I enjoy those stories as well, but this just is there's a bit more complexity, I think, in this story. That it's the story of this young woman who is deeply affected by this experience of knowing this rebellious friend, but still didn't go along with it and didn't become a rebel herself. makes it
right.
a little bit harder to get your arms around in a concrete way, I think.
Well, in some ways, it could be a standard contemporary realism story that's about conformity and late capitalism and the fact that the middle class reproduces itself. And so you go off to camp and you're expected to be part of this cohort of other people like you, and you end up in a job like what your parents had, and you end up hanging out with the people you went to college with and who are on the same class level you are. And there was that one rebel girl who ended up, running off to the city, and who knows what happened to her. But it's more than that, right? Because not only do we have the bug, we have this completely weird and yet horrifying and yet somewhat understandable detail that you're taken away from your parents, and then you have two inanimate objects that act as your parent figures, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's so weird. But yet you can totally see some government bureaucrats, psychologists going, okay, in order to make society work, we need to detach children from their parents. But if we do that, that's going to mess them up. So what we need is a stand-in for the parents, but we can't use other people because other people are reliable. So what if we have them attach themselves to these inanimate objects and invest them with a certain personality and even comfort so that they can have them throughout their lives as a stand-in for their parents?
Yeah. And that's a thing that it's not just the way that's treated in the story is that the campers, I mean, they act like really believable teenagers in this way that they're like, oh, this is stupid, whatever. But then also
right.
they do care about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Later in life, they still have it around.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. This story really, like a lot of these stories have got under my skin in that way. Yeah. And I think, of course, part of it too is just both having been a child and having children of my own. The thought of my kids being taken away from me, or me having been taken away from my parents is just such a viscerally horrifying idea. You can't help but for reading a story like this to be a very emotionally charged experience.
And we should note that the backdrop for this is, as messed up as things are for Tisha, I think is her name, and her cohort, they have it a little easier because they're in food production distribution.
Mm.
And there's this line where it basically says, out of the other cohorts, 3 out of 5 of them joined the army.
Yeah.
So this literally is like the Hunger Games Divergent. This is literally that kind of dystopic society. It's just that this particular story is about the people behind that society who make the army and the war possible because they are taking care of all the infrastructure stuff behind the scenes.
Right. And it is just, again, another, such a brilliant way of, because, I mean, the story isn't only about this. I mean, it is, as with these other things, it is about family. It is about, friendships. It's about, what it means to grow up in a society. But it is not about all the same things that Divergent or Hunger Games is about. It is just sort of taking a different angle on the same questions that are raised in other genre similar stories. So it's just as a prose stylist, she's amazing, but I just feel like the way that she thinks about how to approach such a story is just unexpected for me, at least, And
she doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
The example in this story is kind of gross because they're all throwing up right in the beginning, in the opening scene. But that same sense of not holding back, of not necessarily taking things to the extreme, but taking things to the place that is uncomfortable but telling, repeats in the stories over and over, even up to her being willing to include details that certainly seem autobiographical, but even if not, certainly come from her background.
Yeah. Okay, and then you said you had a 4-way tie for your number 5.
Yeah, so for number 5, I'm still deciding between Honey Bear, An Account of the Land of Witches, The Closest Thing to Animals, and Meet Me in Aram.
So of those, I think the one that I would most like to talk about is The Closest Thing to Animals.
Okay.
Just because that was one that I had read before, and it was the funniest experience that when I was reading this story, I was like, I've read this before, haven't I? I've read this, yeah. I know this story. And then I was like, wait a second, where did I read this before? And then I was trying to backtrack and find out when I had read it and where I had read it. Because even though I had already read the story, the second time through, it just kept doing it,
Mm-hmm. Especially now.
Yeah. So this is the story of some sort of plague has decimated this country or possibly the whole world. And the narrator is a person who is living in basically a quarantined city that's like in a bubble, and it's sort of describing her experience living in this bubble. But again, it's not really about that, right? It's also the story of a young woman who is sort of thwarted in her creative aspirations and keeps meeting other people who then go on to become big famous artists or writers or whatever. And in that way, it is a very it's not a speculative story, and that it could, like, those aspects of the story could very easily have been set in modern day New York, right?
Yep.
So, again, blending these elements in this way and providing this very contemporary story, but setting it in a what if, milieu, it's a thing that she does so well throughout this collection. So what was it about this story that grabbed you?
All the things that you mentioned, because, well, first of all, I'm a sucker for stories that are about artists and writers.
Yeah, me too.
But then also just how weird it was that there's certainly some kind of outbreak or plague, but then at one point they're talking about one of the characters was on a plane and she's looking down and see a crater. It seems like there could also be potentially an alien invasion, especially because of the nature of the outbreak is really weird, because Nadia, who gets the disease, and she's kind of a writer and a visual artist, she manages to survive, but she has to live in a bubble, literally. And she's all furry. She grows this blue fur and these other protuberances, and she considers herself part plant. It's very strange.
Yeah.
And the narrator describes, she uses the word tents, but there seems to be a tent over the entire city. And it definitely takes place in our world, because Minnesota is mentioned, Florida is mentioned, and they put up lights on the interior of the tent for daytime, and then they put different lights up for nighttime for the stars. So kind of visually, it's this really interesting situation setting. So it's about people in quarantine, but it's also about people in quarantine trying to make art. So that was an aspect to it that kind of really resonated this time.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this story is how it's sort of making use of this unreliable narrator, because, and this is something I've talked about with other guests on the show, notably Matthew Salis's, who his novel is written in the first person by a guy who really doesn't seem to understand not only what other people in his life are doing, but really doesn't seem to understand himself very well either. And that is very relevant to this story, because you are presented with her thoughts at the beginning of this story of, how all of these people in her life, they sort of seem to use her and then move on, and then she never hears from them again. And then by the end of the story, when she finally reconnects with Nadia, you get a completely different interpretation of the interactions she's had with these people, where it's actually, according to Nadia, that the narrator is the one who has sort of abandoned her in her time of need. Right. And how she's really the selfish one and who's not dependable, and, really shakes up everything that you've been told through the rest of the story. It's one that I think, reading it a second time so that you can, read the early events and early sort of explanations of the narrators, it gives it a different flavor after you've read the end.
Yeah.
And I remember talking with Matthew Salis about this, how the first person can be such a trap, because the first person is such an intimate point of view that really seduces you into sympathizing with the narrator. And so a lot of the fiction that I find really interesting using the first person are fiction that the narrator thinks of themselves as the sympathetic character, or perhaps the main character. And yet, as the story unfolds, we realize that this person is not exactly who they are presenting themselves as. I love that about this story.
Yeah, and it's also about fiction in general, because how the narrator gets you is with the details that they share. Mm-hmm. So a great example is another way that the narrator has fooled herself is that she meets this visual artist named Hodan. And Hodan seems like a homeless person to her. Mm-hmm. And then turns out to have a place, an apartment, but it's full of all this stuff that Hodan has scavenged, and then she builds these sculptures out of them. And the narrator is determined to say, you know what, this is great work. I'm going to make this person famous. And calls in some favors and gets Hodin's work into a show, and then eventually realized, oh, before quarantine happened, this person was actually already a very famous artist. And all of a sudden, all the details that we thought were meaningful turned out to be not meaningful in the sense that this is the state this person was in, but that in terms of, being, maybe not fully mentally well and being a bit of a hoarder, but it turns out that, oh, no, actually, it's just their artistic process.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, I loved this story too.
And so to extend that, I mean, that's how all fiction lies.
Mm-hmm.
And especially that's how Samatar's fiction can lie, because her details are so good and so precise and so pile up. And part of what I appreciate is that she has that ability to really not only build exquisite sentences, but to see those exquisite sentences with details that really say something. But that a lot of her fiction also points to that or deconstructs that or, interrogates itself and interrogates other narratives that you always feel like there's this ongoing conversation that she's having and that you can have with literature.
So there's one question that I always end all of my conversations for the show with, which feel a little bit funny in the context of these book club episodes.
Okay.
But the question is, if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you. Obviously, this book would be one example, but perhaps another one.
Yeah. So what I want to recommend is a thematic trilogy of films by the German filmmaker Christian Petzold. He calls it his Love in the Times of Oppressive Systems trilogy. And the first film is called Barbara. It takes place in the 1980s in East Germany. The second film is called Phoenix. It takes place post-World War II. And the final film is called Transit. That's based on an amazing novel by the World War II or post-World War II author Anna Sagers. And it takes place, now and also in World War II in 1942. It's really interesting. And all these films are doing something in the sense that they have elements of standard genre films, including noir, romance, thriller, but they do something really interesting with them. So cool. I'm happy to talk more if you want, or we can just leave it at that recommendation. We can let people experience them for themselves. Yeah,
I think that's going to be what it's going to have to be, because I think we're out of time. But listen, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I'm so glad that you picked this book because I really loved it. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike. And I was going to say the same thing. I really enjoyed rereading this collection.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there is a link in the show notes to purchase a copy of Tender, as well as a link to William's website where you can find links to his writing. And if you've got thoughts you'd like to share about today's conversation or about Tender, join in on Twitter by using the hashtag KTCO Book Club. I'd love to hear from you. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you're enjoying these conversations, please help out and spread the word. Tell a friend, share the episodes on social media, and don't forget to tag the show in your tweets at ChannelOpenPod. You can find all of the rest of the show's social media information, email newsletter, show notes, and transcripts at keepthechanneleopen.com. Next time, I'll be talking with poet Carrie Wason about her latest collection, The Slip. That will be coming on February 10th, so do be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.